welcome to this series of reflections on aging gracefully in our world. Now, some of you who know me may be a bit surprised that since my clinical experience has been in pediatrics at the other end of the age spectrum, that I'm now sharing some reflections on aging and the elderly. But my work in ethics and in just health policy has brought me for years to these very issues. Moreover, this past summer, when we reflected on our own goals and missions and priorities, and when the themes of hospitality, home, concerns about homelessness, concerns about providing safe, respectful environments for all, particularly the marginalized, when those came to the fore, I began to think there is a very special mission and call to religious men and women who are a concentrated aging society to model aging gracefully in our world. So these reflections are going to focus on that. And I'm taking a particular challenge from a quote by Karl Rahner, the famous theologian, on his 80th birthday. Father Rahner said, "Old age is a grace, both a mission and a risk. It's not given to everyone. Therefore, growing old is a really serious matter. It is a grace, a mission, and it holds the risk of radical failure." Now, I found those words very challenging, and also accepting this is a grace and a mission not given to all. So to all of us who are given the grace and the mission, these reflections are really to stimulate us to think about what is that call, what is that mission to the world in which we find ourselves. So in this series, we're going to do 3 different kinds of reflections: related and becoming more specific. In this, the first of the series, we're going to talk about a prophetic approach to the reality of aging in the Western world. We're going to look at the demographics of the shift of aging in Western populations and begin to think deeply about the issues of the social and health ramifications of these shifts and the call to justice for the elderly. The second section is going to get more into my field of experience, and we're going to begin to think about issues of prayerful, informed health decisions in aging and what we might begin to contribute as reflections on goals for health and health care in an aging society. And then our final session is going to look at the Christian tradition of a good death. Because as we age, death comes closer into our view, we're going to begin to reflect on how we, as committed Christians, reflect on the notions of dying and death, and how we, in fact, assist each other in providing the context and possibilities for a good death. With those general objectives of the 3 reflections we're going to have, in this session this morning then, the one that stretches me a bit because the healthcare one and the end-of-life one I do all the time, here what I want us to do is to reflect first on this issue of the social and health challenges of the aging societies in the worlds in which we inhabit. The second thing I want us to do is to begin to think carefully of the values and the attitudes in our society about two related things: the values and the attitudes towards aging and the aging process, and values and attitudes towards older persons, particularly dependent elderly. And then third, I'm going to challenge religious, in North America in particular, who have accepted care of their own elderly as a duty, to begin to see this as an unmet need of our time in the tradition of our foremothers and forefathers. Religious women and men have this incredible tradition of seeing an unmet need and responding in creative ways. The single commonest ministry now of religious women, certainly in Canada, in the Sisters of Charity of Halifax, is care for the elderly, recognizing most of the elderly are our own, but it is care for the elderly. So I would like us to look at then the ways in which we might, individually and communally, provide a new way of looking at care of the elderly. So in the little reflection booklet that we put together for you, we've got a description of what we call in health policy, social demographic policy, the population pyramid. These visuals are really important. You'll see the traditional population pyramid is just that. Lots and lots of babies and small children at the base, with a decline in population as different adverse events, infectious diseases, work-related accidents, and the aging process cause us to die. Peaking with a small peak of the elderly and a smaller one of the very elderly. Now, throughout human history, that's been the shape of the population pyramid. Lots of babies born. Unfortunately, historically, lots of babies die. But the base is large and the top was small. Now, in the second image that I've provided for you, it's North American, it's US, but it fits North American perfectly. It doesn't look like a pyramid at all. It's this funny shaped thing representing smaller numbers of babies, fewer children born, a fairly stable population middle, and then a rising population of elderly, 65 and over, with an actual rapid increase of those 80 and over. By the year 2020, in North America, there will be more persons 65 years of age than under 15. So begin to think then what the pyramid that has always looked like this, in fact now has fewer at the bottom and more in this aging population. So if we begin to think about that, it's not just numbers and ages. There are enormous ramifications for health care and the ability to afford it and to provide it appropriately. Huge issues for residence and housing, and substantial issues for social and spiritual support. We've changed the shape of our societies in ways that have made the aging population one to which we now must attend carefully. So if we were to think then of what I'm calling a prophetic response to this issue, what kind of attitudes might we have to think about? Well, first, we have actually serious issues of ageism in our society. By ageism, I mean intentional discrimination against persons simply by reason of their age. We have a rising problem identified clearly in North America of elder abuse. particularly as elder persons are living within family situations in changed social and space situations, such that the pressures of care of the elderly are burdensome and frustrating to families who are no longer at home in large areas like farms with relatives nearby, but urban living with all kinds of pressures, raising all of those stresses that make for abuse, both of children at one end and now we're seeing of the elderly at the other. So we actually have an issue now of justice in as the are aging, and things like the traditional valuing of the elderly for their wisdom have been replaced by turning to the 12-year-old for advice on how to Google something. We have a shift in terms of the role of elders, the role and place of seniors in our society, and in fact, with that comes all kinds of potential issues for discrimination, with particular attention then to discrimination about older people eating up health and social benefits. People write about the so-called tsunami of the elderly. So part of what we're going to have to grapple with if we are to witness a different way of looking at aging is the attitudes that we bring as Christians to the aging, to elders, and to the care that we have to bring them. But we're going to have to be vigilant about ageism and discrimination. We're going to have to be very attentive to issues where the elderly are scapegoated for issues in a youth-oriented, independence-oriented society. So now let's just turn, before we think of some of the questions we might have to deal with, about our understanding of aging itself, the biology of aging. I want to make here a point that I want you to think about. That aging is not a disease. It's a normal human process. Birthing, coming out of the birth canal, is not a disease. It is a normal process at the beginning, and aging and death at the end are the normal decline. Aging itself isn't a disease to be treated, though with aging come medical conditions that in fact can be treated. But many of the realities that occur to the elderly are part of the body wearing out. So we want to keep people functional, we want to keep them comfortable, but our attitude has to be that aging itself is not a disease to be fixed, but as Ronner says, a grace-filled state to be understood and dealt with. The other thing that comes with the biology of aging is the reality that as this body wears out, wears down, my own father said, rusts, as we in fact wear out, there are some physical conditions, limitations to our interaction and our independence that become important for us and that we need to be attentive to. There's some degree of immobility as we stiffen up, some degree of instability, so that getting around, tripping and falls are such a huge problem for the elderly. Relates just to as we get older, our reflexes are not as they were, our stability with our joints and our muscles and our bones and tendons are not what they were. But we also have an issue of both hearing and vision deteriorating as we get older. Now remember, these are normal phenomena in aging. For some people with a hearing loss, that's a disease. Aging makes that worse. For some people, they have very little hearing loss, even into their 90s. But the natural progression of these conditions of aging make seeing well, hearing well, present interesting challenges to interaction and social support. And we'll see in a minute very interesting questions of meaning in aging. In addition, cognitive decline, the issue that strikes terror in the heart of any of us who are aging becomes a real phenomena. Cognitive decline a bit for all of us, and then for many, it deteriorates into serious decline and dementia, causing very, very substantial challenges, again, for respect, for interaction, and for how we care properly for the elderly. So, the population is shifting. We have an unprecedented amount of older persons in our society. This is creating very, very serious challenges, particularly for health and social services. There's a tremendous danger of discrimination and neglect of the elderly, really challenging our notion of a home for everyone and caring for everyone. Biology gives us realities we have to deal with. And then for religious, but this happens for all, but religious should be especially attentive to what I call meaning making in aging. So as these biological things are happening to you, there begin to be serious spiritual questions about your identity. You were the mechanic who in fact fed his household by hard physical labor. And now you can't do any of that. You in fact have cognitive decline. And you were the woman who in fact managed a business and ran a household. And now your identity is you have difficulties with the smallest bit of calculation of numbers and grocery bill. Identity, who you are, can be caught up in being profoundly affected and challenged by the physical realities affecting you. Dignity, as dependence, because that's the natural accompaniment to some of the limitations of aging, comes a move from independence, the value of the Western world in our time, to a certain dependence. And with that comes challenges to dignity. We, in fact, accept that we change diapers and we feed and we care for in the most intimate ways babies and small children. But as we come to the end of our life, those things become, for persons, experiences of loss of dignity. Because things feel undignified, as we know as Christians, doesn't mean the loss of dignity, but challenges to dignity, to identity, and to dependence become serious issues that we have to in some way look at for ourselves and model for the world in which we find ourselves. And then uncertainty and lack of control, a huge question of meaning making and aging. So this is how I dream that Roman Catholic religious might in fact begin to address the question. First, accept the fact that we are a particular concentrated version. If the demographics of the pyramid have changed, we never had the little small babies and we no longer have large numbers. So our pyramid's the other way around. It's on its head, as it were. How can we bring to our aging experience, which has persons coming to their aging and end of life with happy, grace-filled, peace-filled lives? But we've also got religious who come to the end of their lives and they're still holding on to hurts. They're still holding on to issues that, in fact, now as they come, interfere profoundly with their ability to enter into a grace-filled aging in a meaningful way. Can we, in fact, begin to model care and attention to those persons? And more importantly, coming from the world of ethics, where we like to prevent things from getting troublesome, can we begin to think early on about our values and attitudes before we come to issues of serious decline or even dying and death? Can we begin early to think of how to manage these issues? I'm going to suggest then that while religious congregations have a serious issue in finding ways to care for their elderly population, the resources, emotional, financial, physical, that individual religious have been freed from that particular personal worry, which in fact is a nightmare for so many of the elderly in the world we find ourselves, who are not only disproportionately poor and women, but many of whom are now homeless. Can you imagine being homeless at 85? And yet, somehow or other, our world in its neglect of the elderly has those circumstances. So, can we begin then to think personally about our values and attitudes towards aging, towards our health choices, and towards end of life, in a way that would witness a more peaceful, respectful, grace-filled aging process? And communally, then, can we, as religious, model care for the elderly in a way that assists in promoting and facilitating a careful, respectful, attentive care that is, in fact, providing the opportunity for grace-filled aging and dying? Not just as a duty, but as an unmet need. So let's just briefly, I'm going to provoke you now, because we will be leaving you with some questions for reflection at the end of this first piece of the series. And I'm going to start with one that you may think is strange. But I want us to start small and build up to the way we think about our death by starting with somewhat smaller decisions about aging and limitation, aging and possibility. So let's think about, how do you think about the issue of driving and when you should no longer drive, regardless of whether you want to drive or not? Then we can move on to issues of health and healthcare, which will be in depth in the second part of the series, and end of life will be the full reflection in the third. How do you think of something like driving? Because even for religious, driving for older persons is, it's the anchor that holds on to, I'm still independent. I can go where I want. And so it links intimately with much, much deeper questions about dependence and recognition of limits. But we know biologically, the older we get, the slower our reflexes. The older we get, the more likely that we have some degree of forgetfulness. The older we get, the more likely hearing and vision are affected. So as we begin to accept aging, we need to reflect on the meaning of independence that it carries. And then, let me throw in the spanner in the works for my colleagues in family medicine and in geriatrics, which is when they have to tell an older person they can't drive anymore because they're now a risk to others. So how can we model attentiveness to understanding the deep personal independence value of this, but also being persons who are not only concerned about ourselves, but understand the communal societal responsibility and risk to others. So I'm going to get you to think over the course of the next few days before the next part of the series, how does driving begin to uncover some attitudinal things? Then how about place of residence? Well, if we look at the world in which we find ourselves, all older persons will tell you, all of them, they want to age in place. They want to stay in their home for lots of reasons. It's familiar, it is independence, and the like. But in society in general, we know many, many persons can only stay at home when they have an enormous amount of help from loved ones, family and friends. And when does that staying at home begin not just to reflect our responsibility for each other, but an undue burden on family and friends? Do we think about that any differently as religious than folks in general? Moreover, we've got persons who are living alone who are what we call in the geriatric gerontology literature, elder orphans. They're really by themselves, unless there's some church group or social group or other members of the Legion who stop by occasionally. They are virtually orphaned. And their situation becomes exceedingly risky, exceedingly risky. And of course, the other thing we realize in society as a whole, we have so many environments for elderly living alone that are abusive and totally inadequate for respectful care. So in general, we all have this desire to stay at home, but when we think about homes in general, we've got issues that clearly need reflection and a justice orientation for redress. Now, what about religious? Well, our situations are we're not living in unsafe environments. They're often very simple, according to our way of life. Most often, they're actually quite nice. But here we have some interesting challenges as we have religious living alone in the 21st century, religious living in twos, religious living in now small communities, because the situation as you come to aging for each of those has to be reflected upon differently. When you're by yourself as a religious, you fit the category of many elderly in our world who are dependent on friends and family. And while that dependence and support can be a wonderful, positive thing, when does our desire to be independent infringe and overly burden others? Very serious question. When we have religious living at a distance from other sisters, and generally isolated, how does the congregation deal with the pressure and stress they feel for that individual religious now being at risk because they're by themselves and things can happen that in fact cannot be assisted or prevented because of other loved ones? So in a sense, again, I use the term a microcosm. We're an intensification of the issues for our world, and I want us to begin to think more intentionally about those. How about living in twos? This is interesting. This has become a very frequent phenomena for North American religious. Two sisters or brothers, two sisters in particular, would be living together. Now the issue is if they're both aging, each of them begins to try to protect the other from the evident problematic of aging. They each try to cover up, if we could use that kind of language, because they're both aging. But if one has needs now that are becoming excessive, extreme, and the other person who has perhaps lived with this sister for a long period of time feels obliged, now we have a kind of coercive care where neither of them is free to sit back and reflect on what is the proper place and site for care. And I don't think we've even begun to discuss together those issues, not by naming individuals, not by naming examples, but by thinking of experiences that then cause us to have general reflection upon how do we look at this issue. Because what's the other side of this? Well, the other side of this is if you can't live alone and you have increased dependency needs, and you really shouldn't even be with one other person because of your increased needs, nor in a small community because of your increased needs, then you have to go to residential care. Now, we have one of the great problematics for elderly in our time. In all of the general public lectures I've done on aging and ethics in an aging society, the single commonest thing you hear, both from persons who are in senior residences, nursing homes, long-term care facilities, and their loved ones who put them there, is this: Sister Nuola, my mother said to me repeatedly, no matter what happens to me, honey, never put me in a nursing home. And yet there came a time when I could not any longer care for her properly and fulfill my obligations to my own family and to work. It broke my heart. She still is angry with me for putting her into a residence. Now, that happens with religious as well as it does families. We now need to begin to think about two things. Not just the attitudinal issue of when we need care, but what is the communal responsibility for the kind of place we would shape that would make a residential facility for an older person, including a dependent older person, at home. This is where hospitality, home, care, attention to the issues of meaning and support in aging become crucially important. So enormous challenges, I think, personally, for us all, way ahead of the time that either no one's going to tell me what to do becomes the response, or a disaster occurs for an older person who has not been able early enough on to begin to be open and attentive to these issues and make decisions that in fact make for a better aging and a better end of life. But communally, the obligations are now huge. What kind of places for home and safety and respect for dignity and respect for the individual, even independence? What kind of places do we create, and what kind of advocacy from those experiences, personally and communally, can we bring to the world who desperately needs them? So these are bigger picture issues, but if we don't start thinking about the values and attitudes in smaller things, as if the decision not to drive was small, then we can't prepare ourselves well for the bigger ones of use of healthcare and end-of-life decisions. So now there are some reflection questions that I'm going to propose. You may have many others, but I want you to particularly attend to these. So the first one is very personal. I want you to reflect on the question, how do you approach aging, and how do you model aging? I want you to ask yourself the question, what are your greatest fears as you age? I want you personally and with others to reflect on what are the practical issues necessary to be in place so that we can assist individuals in making decisions as they age that move them towards aging in a more grace-filled and positive way. And then two reflections that move us into the way in which we need to provide a response communally. So the first would be, what do you wish for in care if you lose independence and need to go to some communal facility? What would that look like and feel like for you to be home? And then, what really then are the features that our homes for the elderly, our homes for the elderly, our nursing homes, our long-term care facilities, what ought they look like to be truly hospitable places for the aging?